Okay, I think we would like to make a start any second. We are going to record this, so now will be the time to stop discussing things. Okay, great. So welcome to the RISE panel discussion 2017. Before I describe the event today, I just want to do a couple of pieces of housekeeping. The first is, one really important thing today is we're going to record this and put it out on our YouTube channel. And we want to make sure that all of the discussion from our panelists, but also from the floor, gets recorded. So if you would like to make a point, and there will be plenty of time for audience members to ask questions and give feedback, we will need you to be speaking into the microphone. And Denitza and Charlotte, sat at opposite sides of the room, will come and give you a microphone. It would be great if you could also introduce yourself prior to asking your question. So that's the first point. The second is, as I'm sure all of you are aware, Outfit's on this week, and there are lots of events with RISE participants in them. You will find a list outside describing all of these events. There will be RISE research teams giving their presentations. One thing we really would like to flag is tomorrow, that's Tuesday the 5th of September, that between 4 and 5:30 p.m. we have a workshop on our systems diagnostic. The title is, What Have We Learned from Running an Education System Diagnostic? And many of the RISE members will be there tomorrow. Lance Pritchard, our research director, will be dialing in. So we'd really encourage you to register for that workshop and come along and see us tomorrow at 4 p.m. It's in room 6, which means nothing to me, but it probably will when we arrive tomorrow at New College. Okay, I'm Claire Lever, I should have said that up. I'm the research coordinator for RISE. And all I'm going to say really today is just very briefly give you an introduction as to why we thought now was a good time to hold an event around the theme of equity in education. So equity in education has been researched and discussed extensively for a long time. But right now, as we're thinking about the pivot from focusing on enrolment to focusing on learning, it's a good time to refresh our understanding of what equity means in education, and in particular what it means in the context of education systems reform. And that's what today is about. The question we're hoping to address is, what is equity in the context of education system reform? Our panel discussion will include 4 panellists, Louise Crouch, Angela Little, Kane Rollison, and Pauline Rose, and they will introduce themselves as they speak. One of the things that we will include in that will be an analysis of the concept equal rights, equal rise. The idea that education systems should be inclusive of all as a matter of rights, but also focus on improving learning performance at all levels, because including the marginalised into a dysfunctional system is not a goal that will lead to significant increases in learning. Louise and Kane are going to, in particular, talk about their RISE Insight Note that was recently published on the RISE website. You will find copies outside, and you can download that from the website afterwards. So I'm going to hand the floor over to them to give a presentation that will focus on the key parts of their RISE Insight Note. So the floor is yours. You have half an hour.
Thank you. So I'm Kane Rollison from UCL and also involved in RISE projects in Ethiopia, Vietnam, and in the RISE Intellectual Leadership team. This is work that I've conducted with Lewis, but which we've been discussing in various RISE forums for quite some time, really since the project began. What's the role of equity in shaping the decisions that we make about research and also about policy? So, for example, the equity questions that we'll come to here are implicit in all of the work that RISE is doing, because projects which are concerned with improving education and quality in developing countries must inherently be concerned with equity. But we thought it was, as Claire said, time to examine in a bit more detail what that might mean. First of all, in a kind of conceptual way, and then secondly, in terms of the empirical data. So, why does equity matter in global education is where we're going to start this few minutes of conceptual discussion. Moving on then to the difference between equity, inequality, the relationships between equity and justice, and equality of opportunity. Those are kind of big topics, right? So we don't have a huge amount of time, but we'd be very glad for your comments on the way that we've put this framework together. And then following that, we'll look at 3 empirical questions. The first one, what are the key axes and sources of inequality in learning outcomes? So where does learning inequality come from, and how is it characterized in terms of differences between groups, between countries, and across groups and countries? And then secondly, what is the relative importance of those kinds of inequalities. So is it the case that across the world, most of the inequality in educational outcomes consists in the differences between countries or the differences within countries? And within the countries, what are the groups which matter most in terms of inequality? And then finally, we look at a question which is specific to the issue of improving education systems in developing countries. What are the choices and routes that countries must make in improving learning outcomes with respect to the balance of equity, inequality, and outcomes improvement growth? So, for example, are there some paths towards improving outcomes which are more equitable than others, more equal than others, fairer than others, and how should systems try to target those, and empirically, what strategies are required? So why do we focus on equity? Of course, as we said, it's implicit in everything we're doing, but it's also implicit in the fact that low learning outcomes across the developing world are partly driven by high levels of inequality. In fact, the lower the level of educational outcomes, typically the more unequal those outcomes are in any particular context. And that's true within schools, within countries, and between pupils. So that you look at, for example, the distribution of learning outcomes in any developing country, you'll find there's usually a long tail of low-performing schools, which contains a long tail of low-performing children. And that's not to say that, of course, there aren't high-performing children in every country, however developed it is. And we find that, for example, in India, about 5% of pupils perform at levels which are equivalent to the OECD. And, of course, 5% of children in India is many millions of qualified doctors, teachers, engineers, and lawyers in the future, but it's not 95% of pupils. 95% of pupils are performing at much lower levels. So in many countries, it's not just the case that there is a large group of low-performing pupils, but those inadequate learning levels and low levels of learning outcomes are, in fact, not just a matter of a low standard, but of a high level of inequality. And that high level of inequality is unfair in the sense that it's the result of unequal opportunity and inadequate opportunity, because if you're measuring learning outcomes as an indicator of what opportunities to learn children have had, then in many countries those opportunities are far lower, far weaker than would be sufficient to provide for adequate learning outcomes. So that we consider to be not just a crisis of learning outcomes, which is well documented, but a crisis of equity in education systems. And of course that crisis of equity is partly a crisis of inequality, because the poorer the country, the more unequal the outcomes. But it's not just about inequality. So we wanted to distinguish between inequity and inequality, because equity judgments require a philosophical position. They're not just empirical. So inequality is a matter of empirical investigation. To say that two outcomes are not the same is a matter of a technical question. It can be investigated from data. But inequality questions require some judgments to be made about what position one adopts in terms of what would be a fair situation. So what we're concerned with in terms of equity is about unfair inequality. And you can have, of course, unfair inequality and unfair equality. Unfair inequality is where inequality is not the result of fair starting points. So we might say, for example, that inequality in wages, which is linked to different levels of skills, is a fair inequality rather than an unfair inequality. But the question is, did people have equal opportunity to reach, for example, the levels of education which would allow them to have those differences in wages? And that is the equity question. So, raising learning outcomes, which of course is what RISE is all about, may be a question of raising learning outcomes among a majority of children who are at low levels of learning in what we're calling the floor of the distribution, the long tail of poor performing pupils, which, depending on the context, can amount to a substantial majority of pupils in a country. And if that's the case, it's not about developing strategies which are exclusively focused on small disadvantaged groups or relatively small disadvantaged groups. It can be the case that inequality is very large because a large group of pupils are performing very poorly, and that may be people from all sorts of regions, from both genders, from different social classes, because perhaps the real reason for poor performance is an inadequate schooling system rather than home background disadvantage. So to say a little bit more about equity, equity is concerned in philosophical terms with fairness or justice. So it's not, as we said, a pure technical issue. And you can't have a position on equity if you don't have a position on fairness and a position on justice. And there is no debate about equity unless there can be a debate about the value judgments which lie behind people's equity positions. So before we investigate inequality in empirical terms, we want to understand what is the equity position that we might want to adopt or support in respect of education and global educational improvement. And to compare different positions, we might think of, let's say, for example, a libertarian versus an egalitarian having different positions on what would be an equitable distribution of outcomes. A preference, for example, for more personal liberty at the expense of some equality, or a preference for greater equality at the expense of some personal liberty. And that's not necessarily a judgment which we can easily make for other people. But in the end, because these are traded off, there is only a certain amount of equity one can have whilst preserving, equality whilst preserving individual liberty and vice versa. There has to be some arbitration between how much liberty and how much equality a system is going to promote. And the essential arbiter there is going to be justice, social justice. What do we think is the fair distribution of opportunity which can lead then to equitable outcomes? So, for example, to contrast unfair inequality with unfair equality, we think in this paper about an example of a country which has very low learning outcomes, which are universally low. And they are the result of a universally poor education system which delivers low learning outcomes for everyone. Now, in that system, you have a high level of equality because learning outcomes are equally low for everyone. But you have a very high level of inequity, because it is not fair nor just that everyone should receive such poor quality education that does not permit them then to develop their skills and talents in future life. So just because something is equal doesn't mean that it is fair. And education must distinguish between inequality and inequity. Both, of course, are in some senses undesirable, but inequality is not always desirable. Fair inequality is a good thing in society. Unfair inequality is not. But inequity is always undesirable. So whatever your position, whatever your value judgments about what is fair and what is right are, whatever is inequitable will always be undesirable. And I think we briefly then developed this position out of Rawls' theory of justice, in which he explains two principles that we should observe in establishing a just distribution of outcomes. Firstly, that there should always be equal basic liberties in a society. But secondly, that there should be fair equality of opportunity. And he describes that in terms of an effective equal chance. And an effective equal chance, of course, can mean many different things. But I think it means rather more than equal access to very basic public services. So equal access to basic public services does not necessarily provide sufficiently for what we're thinking of here as an effective equal chance to access the true benefits of education in society. And I think that's something clearly that a society has to decide. And when resources are constrained, as they are in many developing countries, the question of how to distribute that effective equal chance, where to focus, for example, should one subsidize higher education at the expense of basic education, those kinds of decisions are really tough. So, in the end, what Rawls suggests is that a social contract which would observe these principles would ultimately lead to a principle of difference which only allowed for what we're calling fair inequalities, i.e. those that benefit society in general. So those which are based on merit, those which may be based on ability, but which are not based, for example, on unequal access to basic education. That's an unfair inequality. There is no basis for such inequality in a theory of justice. So society must focus on providing opportunity to those who need it most first. And fair inequalities of outcome are not possible except where there is equality of opportunity. And societies that create equal opportunity then have unequal outcomes which are based on merit and effort. And all of the benefits of basic education are extendable to the whole of society without any loss to anyone else. So they're not positional. Certain income benefits of education, for example, are positional. They can't be extended to everyone. The wage premium of a doctor cannot be extended to everyone by definition. But the benefits of parents, the benefits of good quality parenting, of the benefits of education in terms of health, in terms of gender equity, in terms of fertility, all these kinds of benefits are extendable to everyone without any loss. They are not positional benefits. And so there cannot be a grounds for rationing those sorts of benefits on the grounds of merit. However, finally, on this more conceptual part, the question of how to equalise opportunities is, of course, an empirical question. We can't resolve that purely on the basis of a view about equity, and it matters in terms of what data we have, and that's what Lewis will explain a bit more about in a moment. But what's the question about who to target? Should we be targeting, for example, gender? Should we be targeting location? Should we be targeting rural versus urban? Are those the axes of disadvantage that matter? Or is there something else? Should we just be targeting, for example, the lowest performers? And some data here from Young Lives will explain how those gaps are actually found, not just across and within countries, but in the combination of those two gaps actually gives us rather different findings when we compare here India, which is Andhra Pradesh and Telangana states, and Vietnam. At the same age about 14.5, pupils in a secondary school effectiveness survey conducted by Young Lives, we can see that whatever axes of inequality you take, first we have urban-rural, second is gender, male and female, third is the highest performing district versus the lowest performing district. Whatever axis you take, there are gaps, of course, in both countries. And sometimes the gaps are very large. The gap between the highest performing pupils in Vietnam by district and the lowest performing pupils in Vietnam by district is very large, as it is in India. But in the end, the larger gaps are always between Vietnam and India. And if we think about simulating how we could improve the performance of pupils in India to the level of those in Vietnam, how would we eliminate gaps that would achieve that? It wouldn't do much good to eliminate the gender gap in India. You would only remove about 15% of the gap between India and Vietnam if you did that. If you remove the urban-rural gap, or you remove the gap between the most highly performing district and the least highly performing district, you might get 50% of the gap between Vietnam and India closed. But the only way I could find to eliminate the entire gap between the two countries would be to raise the level of maternal education of all the children in India to a university level, which of course is a huge change because the vast majority of parents are educated only to primary level. So massive change will be required in order to have the same level of maternal education, which would be sufficient to raise learning outcomes to those in Vietnam. Now that's one thing. Of course the backgrounds make a huge difference, but we can see that those are affected by the kinds of schools that children are selected into. And this graph, again from Young Lives, relates only to India, in which we look at the school quality measured by the value added of the school. So here schools are measured, that performance of pupils is measured at the beginning of the school year and then again at the end of the school year, and then we estimate the school value added in terms of a fixed effect, and then look at how that is related to the children that happen to access that school. So first of all here, by maternal education, you can see that in India, the more education your parents have, or the more education your mother has, the more value added the school that you went to produced, i.e. just the case that more advantaged children go to better quality schools, those that enhance their education or that increase their learning outcomes faster. So you've got two effects. First of all, the background effect. Second of all, the school effect. And then thirdly, there are some within school effects too, so that pupils who are more advantaged, even within the same school, make more progress. Interesting one here for India, because you would think, perhaps, that boys and girls, on average, since most schools comprise about 50% boys and 50% girls, should have similar value-added estimates. But they don't. There is a big difference between boys and girls value-added, which must suggest, unless we can think of another explanation, it must suggest that boys are selected to go to better schools by their parents than girls are, so that there are some intra-family decisions which favour boys in India too. And finally, before I hand over to Lewis, We looked then at school effectiveness in India across the distribution of schools in 4 school types: private aided schools, private unaided, state government schools, and tribal and social welfare schools. And you can see that India epitomizes here the unequal education system. The blue dots, the private unaided schools, are the highest performing schools, and they're also the schools where the richest pupils go. So the horizontal axis is the mean pupil asset score, and the vertical axis is the school's performance. So richer children go to better performing schools, and also, it turns out, schools that add more value. With the state government schools, there's rather a lottery. Actually, it doesn't matter what the backgrounds of children are. There are some effective state schools or some more highly performing state schools, but really, whether you go to one or not is pretty much a postcode lottery. So the triple disadvantage that we see, particularly in India, but also in other unequal countries, is the effect of home disadvantage compounded by the effect of school quality disadvantage, and then thirdly, some within school effectiveness. So, for example, it could be discrimination, it could be language of instruction, it could be, for example, overambitious curricula, but it could be explicit discrimination, as we see in terms of gender and caste sometimes in India, whereby children of the same level of home background perform worse under certain conditions. So back to the 3 empirical issues. Lewis has got some more information on those.
Thank you, Ken. Do I still have 15 minutes? Okay. I'm Luis Crouch from RTI, and what I'd like to talk about is these 3 empirical questions in the context of an analysis that I've been doing as part of the RISE effort, basically of all the international assessments, in all subjects and all grades, the most recent wave of all the international assessments. So we'll be able to talk about these 3 things in the context of all the big international assessments. And so what I'd like to do is first talk a little bit about what are the axes of inequality in learning outcomes. A couple of graphs on that, though I've got more information. Basically, what you see, taking SACMAC, the assessment that's produced in Southern and Eastern Africa of learning outcomes. And what you've got in the 2 bars is the 2 subjects, reading and mathematics, and each bar represents a difference. So it's a difference, in this case, between the best off and worst off in terms of learning outcomes regions, the boys-girls difference, the urban-rural difference, the rich-poor, and what I have taken to call total inequality or pure inequality, which is just the difference between the best performing kids and the worst performing kids. Notice that I did it at the 75th and 25th percentiles of the distribution because all these other variables are dichotomous. And so I wanted to create a dichotomous equivalent for learning outcomes by taking the 75th and 25th percentile, not the 90th and the 10th or the 95th and the 5th. That would produce more drama, but you can't equate it to the other ones in some sense. And now one might wonder, well, what is large? I mean, are these large differences? Certainly some are larger than others, and you can see clearly that in a sense, the worst source of inequality is what you would call inequality itself. It's just the randomness and poor quality control and low standards, if you will, such that there's just a big difference between well-performing kids and not so well-performing kids. And then the difference between boys and girls, for example, is very small. That's why, as Kane was saying, in these countries, if you eliminate the gender difference in learning outcomes, you're not going to be accomplishing much as compared to the total inequality. And if you want to have some gauge of size, that's 1 standard deviation. And in the literature, typically, 1/4 of a standard deviation is considered a big effect. So you can see that these are all big effects, except for the gender one. But the biggest effect by far is low standards, just a long tail of the distribution, randomness, bad management, lack of systems. And you observe the same thing. And this is SACMEC using, and the bars are country averages, the averages of all the countries. You get the same thing if you examine another international assessment, PISA, 2015 in science, which is the one that has the most wealth of data. And in this case, I listed all the countries so that you can see the variation between countries as well, not just sort of averages. And these are the differences due to randomness or bad management or just inequality between high learning and low learning. And you can see that it's enormous, these differences within countries. This would be considered a significant difference, a quarter of a standard deviation. This is the average difference between the better learning kids and the worse learning kids. It's about 1.5 standard deviations, or about equal to 4 grades. So the most advantaged kids are 4 grades ahead of the less advantaged kids. And then you look at the same distribution between rich and poor kids. It's big, but not as big. And then the distribution between boys and girls is tiny. Doesn't even rise to what one could call a significant effect, a quarter of a standard deviation. So exactly the same thing that you see in SACMEC. Kind of total inequality or inequality due to random school management and lack of standards, lack of supervision, tends to be the biggest source, then income, then gender, then income, then often urban, rural, or region of the country, and then gender last. So that's with regard to inequality components or inequality factors. And that's fairly well known. So I'll spend a little bit more time with a couple of other findings, empirical findings, that I think are newer and perhaps therefore more interesting. And one is the beginning work, kind of starting work that we're doing, although there is some precedent for this, examining between and within country inequality. And this is significant in particular to kind of international efforts to work with countries. If most of the differences between countries, then in a sense the task of the international agencies, the NGOs, the global NGOs and so on, is to help countries, the poorer countries, improve their averages. If most of the inequality in the world is within countries, then in a sense the task of the international organizations, NGOs, international development agencies, and the countries together is to work on the long left tail of their own distributions. Okay? So it's an important empirical question. And I'll show you how we've been looking at it. I say that it's work in progress. And the best overall answer that I've been able to come up with, looking at all the countries and looking at all the assessments, is about 40 to 50% of the inequality is between countries, and 50 to 60% is within countries. So about half is within countries, but maybe a little bit more than half is within countries. And this is similar to the global income distribution. And the policy implications, I've already hinted at them, but let me share with you the evidence. So this is using TIMSS, the TIMSS International Assessment in Mathematics, the grade 4 mathematics score. And what I've graphed here is the percentile of the distribution, so country by country. This is the 5% least learning kids, 25, 50, the 95% sort of most learning kids. And these are their scores on the TIMSS scale. And these lines are the countries. So this is a country whose bottom 5% of the kids were scoring about 175, and their best scoring kids were about 470, and so on. And you can use this to develop a sense of how much inequality there is between and within countries in this way. Total inequality is the difference between the least learning kid in the least learning country and, in a sense, the most learning kid in the most learning country. And so that yellow arrow is total global inequality. this other yellow arrow is the difference between the least learning kid in the median country and the most learning kid in the median country. So you take a median country, hypothetical median country, and you look at the difference between the kids that are learning the least and the kids that are learning the most in that country, and that's measured by the size of that arrow. And then the within country inequality is you take the average country or the median country in the distribution, and you look at the difference between their least learning kids in that country and the most learning kid in that country. And you add those up, and you get that about half the inequality is within countries. Same thing in PISA, but just to make sure that you get the sense that things are slightly different depending on the assessment. In PISA, you got a bigger arrow here. So that within country inequality as measured by PISA is greater. And that kind of maybe makes sense because you're talking about maybe grade 8. So in TIMSS, you're talking about grade 4. And schooling systems tend to generate inequality, actually, more than deal with it. So it might make sense. So about, let's say, half of the inequality is within countries. Last empirical point, I think I've got 5 more minutes, is maybe, I think, kind of the newest point, and therefore perhaps the most interesting, which is, do countries progress in terms of their average scores? Do countries progress by addressing and reducing the percentage of kids that are learning the least in their countries, or by sort of building up their geniuses, if you will? In other words, do they address the cognitively very poor, or cognitive poverty, and that boosts up the average, or do they improve the advantage of the already advantaged? And the answer is that it depends. In going from very low levels of average performance, it seems that countries improve by reducing the number of kids in their societies that score very badly. And in going between average performance and top country performance by improving the number of kids that are performing quite well. And let me show you a little movie, a little data movie that shows that precisely. So this is the percentage of kids or students in the TIMSS assessment, the math grade 4 assessment, by proficiency level. And these are the 5 TIMSS proficiency levels. So these are the kids that are learning the least. These are the kids that are learning the most, scoring really well on the test. And this is the percentage of kids in each of those levels. So you're going to be seeing histograms. And what I'm going to show you is a dynamic, a build of the histograms of countries. And I'm bringing the countries in by average score. So the countries with the lowest scores are going to be coming first in the diagram. And then you'll see it build up, and you'll see precisely what I mean. So the first country, I forget which one it is, has the enormous majority of their kids learning very low. And that echoes what Kane was saying about a society where almost everyone learns nothing or very little. And then you see, remember, I'm bringing these in according to their average. So what you see is that as countries improve their average, what you're seeing is a very fast reduction in the percentage of kids learning very little, and almost no increase in the percentage of kids learning a lot, maybe a little bit of increase here. And it's quite dramatic. And it's really only until you get about to the median, or because now I've brought up about half of the countries in the assessment, that these two levels are about the same, and then you start seeing this one increase until you get to the Singapores, the Japans, the Koreas there. So you see a kind of creation of this kind of cognitive middle class as countries move from middle to, from low to middle, and then from middle to high. And yeah, same thing with a slightly different graph. You take the highest performing countries, and that's, the lowest performing countries, in this case Dominican Republic, Algeria, and Kosovo, is this red line with about 55% of the kids scoring very little, very low. And then the middle group of countries, where kids are scoring about average in terms of the worldwide distribution, and you see a vast reduction in these two levels in PISA, and almost no increase in these levels. As countries move from the red line to the green line, and then as countries move from the green line to the blue line, where the blue line is sort of the countries that are on average excellent, you see some reduction here and the beginning of a big increase over here. So it's a big difference between moving from low average performance to middle average performance, and from middle average performance to top. This is a more complex graph, and I'll take just 1 minute to explain it, because this is actually the strongest form of evidence that I've uncovered so far, which is, again, ranging here the scores of children across countries, and here the percentage of kids in either the bottom category or the top category. And you can see that as countries go from very low performance to the median, this is the median across countries, you get a very fast reduction in the proportion of kids that are performing very badly, and then almost no further reduction, which makes sense. You've already reached a very low level. And in going from very low performance to median performance, a very slight increase in the proportion of kids performing super well. And then once you get past the median, then this line, whoop, starts picking up. So very clear patterns of evidence, and I've got it for all the tests in the most recent wave of each single test. And it's an appendix. Obviously, you don't have time. So just to summarize and to end up, what are the policy implications that we see coming from these data? One is that it may be justified to focus on pure and unjust inequality, which is due to random assignment mismanagement, what Keynes called the quality lottery, lack of standards, quality control. And this affects the poor and the rich very differently in a society. The rich are much less exposed to lotteries. The poor are much more exposed to lotteries, to quality lotteries. Factors such as gender and location are relatively weak proxies for the total inequality. If you cannot use a gender or location as a proxy, you have to measure. So that's an important argument for measuring these things. And so therefore, you focus on cognitive poverty, the equivalent of a poverty line. And like I said, countries that move their averages up from very low average to middle average performance do so by reducing the percentage of children at very low levels. So it's equivalent to poverty fighting and an overall improvement, and it creates a virtuous cycle. So that suggests more of a focus on poverty than on inequality. Work on the percentage of kids that are doing really badly. Break down the triple disadvantage created by the fact that management and standards are so random, or the standards are not applied, combines, for example, with home disadvantage and with gender discrimination or ethnic discrimination to create a triple disadvantage, or linguistic discrimination to create a triple disadvantage. Like I said, if you graph performance by income in developing countries, you get a huge variance among the poor and relatively little variance among the rich. The rich are not exposed to the lottery. And so you have to break down that triple disadvantage by working on levels on the nature of quality control in the schools. Maybe the fact that curricular expectations in most countries currently shock the learner as they enter the schooling system, and there's just too much of a leap expected in the first grade or two between the child's home background and what they're expected to do in school, often called teaching at the wrong level, or not teaching at the right level. And there's lots of repetition in the early grades and low learning as a result of that initial shock. And then we need more research on what countries that are moving from those low averages of performance to medium averages, what have they done to address the bottom of their distribution? What are the specific policies? Is it accountability? Is it better support to teachers? Is it better in-service training? So let's relook at these systemic factors, not just in terms of whether they improve quality on average, but which are the factors that specifically help the countries address that extreme left tail of their distributions? Because that seems to be the path toward improving the overall average. So I think maybe we have one more point. And in terms of the role of international agencies and international NGOs and think tanks such as RISE, if half of cognitive inequality is within countries, if half of the global cognitive inequality is within countries, and if the goal is to improve global quality and cognitive wealth and equality, then a role for international agencies and think tanks is not just to help countries improve their averages, but to focus on the equivalent of the ultra poor and the truly cognitively disadvantaged, not as proxied by other factors, but as measured directly. And global efforts to set some kind of minimum standards would probably be helpful in that respect. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry it took so long.
Okay, great. We're now going to invite all four of our panelists to come down. So, Angela, perhaps if you could sit furthest to the left. We'll have Lewis and Kane in the middle and Pauline here. And Angela and Pauline are now going to take 10 minutes each. Does that keep us on track? Yeah. And then we'll open the floor to general discussion. Everyone's mic's on, or at least the most important one is Angela's at this moment. Okay. The floor's yours.
Thank you very much. I'm Angela Little, UCL Institute of Education. Well, I'm in some ways, although I'm clearly the oldest on this panel, I'm also the new girl on the block, in the sense that this is the first time that I've had the opportunity to engage with the RISE team, for which thank you very much. I have in the past worked on related projects, most recently in the CREATE consortium on education access, and in the past on a number of inter-country projects, particularly on education disadvantage and multi-grade education, rural education, etc. Although neither Lewis nor Kane talked about the 6 C's, it is de rigueur, I think, in these sorts of meetings these days to talk about 21st century skills and the 6 C's of critical thinking, collaboration, communication, creativity, citizenship, and character education. I'm not actually going to talk about those 6 C's, but I am going to talk about 6 C's in relation to the presentation we've just had. And those are crisis, comparison, concepts, context, curves, and consequences. And I'm going to talk about them in 3 pairs. So first of all, crisis and comparison. Kane started out by talking about the learning crisis. The fact that the median level of achievement in many developing countries equates to approximately the 5th percentile of the distribution in OECD countries. The 5th percentile of the distribution, of course, is a level at which in OECD countries pupils may be expected to be receiving remedial intervention. I think this is a very compelling statement, and it seems to be the opening gambit for the argument in the technical note. I suppose I've got a slight query about the term crisis. Now I'm going to be the old girl because I'm going to remind you that in 1968, Phil Coombs wrote a book called The World Education Crisis. And I think the subtitle was A Systems Analysis. And I'm just wondering to what extent the RISE team has undertaken a systematic comparison of their work plans and their work objectives with those that underpinned Phil Coombs' work back in 1968. I think Phil was probably more concerned at that stage with questions of access, whereas RISE are very concerned with questions of learning levels. But a comment on that would be useful. Which brings me, I think, to the point about comparison and the importance, if at all possible, of gaining comparisons over time. The graphs that we've been presented with, particularly the last few that Lewis presented, of course, it's a cross-section of countries. Countries with low averages, medium averages, and high average performance at the same point in time. And I appreciate that over the last 50 to 60 years, we have had a growing number of international comparisons of educational achievement. And of course, the tests that have been used have changed over time. I suspect that the team is already looking in some depth at all possibilities, looking at comparisons over time. Because if we go back to the 1960s and the IEA studies, the International Studies of Educational Achievement, which were the ancestors of TIMSS and PISA, there were 4 developing countries in those early studies: Chile, India, Thailand, and Iran. I think India was only an urban sample. I think the Chilean sample was also only urban. But I'm just wondering if there is anything that can be learned to inform and enlighten this very, very important argument, and very new argument, I think, that the RISE team is beginning to present about the way in which countries move from low performance to medium to high performance. So those are my quick comments on crisis and comparison. Now, concepts and context. I would congratulate the team on their very thoughtful discussion in section 1 of their technical paper on notions of equity and equality and notions of justice and fairness. I think in our field of study, the terms equity, inequity, equality, inequality are bandied around in a completely thoughtless manner. People use the terms equity and equality interchangeably, without a moment's thought. So the careful distinction between equity and equality is very, very welcome indeed. And just to expand a little bit on the Rawlsian principles, which I think, for those of you who are not aware of Rawlsian theory and the theory of justice, it is worth spending an hour or two on it. I mean, basically what the theory is saying is that societies should, and I underline should here, be arranged so that the greatest possible amount of liberty is given to its members, limited only by the idea that the liberty of one member should not infringe on that of another. And the notion that inequalities are only to be allowed if the worst off will be better off than they might have been under an equal distribution. And as Kane has already spelt out, this theory leads us to the notions of inequalities that are fair and equalities that are unfair. And I don't think those notions are at the front of a lot of our conversations about education and education policy. I think the RISE team is absolutely right in bringing them up to the front, and hopefully these will begin to frame many more of our debates in the future. Context. We will note straight away, I think, that the Rawlsian theory is rooted in Western philosophy, rooted in long-standing traditions about liberalism, about egalitarianism. And while it is a philosophy that underpins some systems or some parts of systems of education to a greater or lesser extent, is it a universal philosophy? And if not, could it be a universal philosophy? And that leads me to a question for the RISE team, and it may be already I'm asking a question which has already been anticipated, and there is work ongoing. But to what extent does the RISE team need to explore the political philosophy as well as the political economy of the countries with which it is working in order to seek to improve policies that promote equity? So those are my points about the concepts of equity, equality, and context. Finally, curves and consequences. Now, throughout the presentation this morning, we've had a number of references to the long tail of poor performance that drifts off to the left. So I think in introducing the crisis, Kane has spoken about the low median level of performance driven by a long tail of poor performance of schools and pupils. And Lewis also spoke about the long left tail of the distribution and the need to think about and explore interventions that focus on the long left tail. But at no point during the presentation have we had a graphic that demonstrates that long left tail. And that worries me because I trained as a psychologist, well, psychology and sociology and a bit of philosophy thrown in. In my understanding of distributions, and particularly my understanding of normal curves, I'm imagining that if your median, certainly if your average score falls to the left, in other words, you're performing not very well, then the bulk of your scores are probably to the left. Your tail is drifting off to the right, to high performance. So I think that in our lower performing countries, we've got a right tail of high performance, a long, long tail that drifts off to the right, and we've got a bulge, not a tail, we've got a bulge of low performance. So I think I'd like a bit of clarification on that. I think we're mixing our metaphors, and what worries me is that if we, the title of the paper, I haven't got it here, but it's something like focusing on the, what is the subtitle? Raising...
Starts with the tail.
Yeah.
Starts with
equitable
the tail.
improvement starts with the tail. It doesn't. If you start with the tail and you're successful, then you will reach the opposite effect of what you're trying to achieve. Because if you start with the tail, you're starting with your high achievers, not with your lower achievers. I think we're mixing metaphors, and I think we just need to sort this out a bit. So that leads me then to consequences. Assuming that the team is able to demonstrate the tail, either right or left, and I'm assuming that they can do. And I'm absolutely convinced that you're right at the moment, that we need to focus more and more on the low achievers. How can we do this? And what is RISE doing by way of exploring this? You've already outlined, you've given us some curves from Macau, Hong Kong, Singapore, from the PISA studies. In the SACMEC studies, I think your high achievers were Tanzania, Seychelles, and Mauritius. So, what have these countries done historically in order to move them up to that position? Where is the subgroup working on the history of education policy in these countries? Secondly, the McKinsey report. McKinsey asked the question, how do the world's best performing school systems come out on top? One of the answers was they ensure that every child is able to benefit from excellent instruction through targeted support. They raise the standard of every student. Are we able to go back into the McKinsey data archive and dig around? Can we learn anything from the McKinsey data about the specifics of those targeting policies and those targeting practices? If I think back to some of the literature reviews that were commissioned in the last 5 years by DFID, there was a group led by Westbrook looking at the factors that had an impact on learning achievement. One of the factors that seemed to come out consistently was the use by the teacher of feedback on performance to students, sustained attention and inclusion. To what extent are our teachers in classrooms using feedback from academic performance in order to inform their teaching practices, which inform the learning practices of the student, which raise the level of the student? Or to what extent are our teachers just using assessment to continuously assess in order to rank order students? The suggestion was that if the teacher is able to, has been trained to, use assessment feedback to inform teaching practices, this can have a marked impact on achievement. Certainly in my own work, in a recent study we've done on English language teaching in Sri Lanka, where we've observed almost 200 teachers on multiple occasions, the curriculum objective of that English language teaching is to promote more student-centred tasks. And we have observed that teachers who report, we didn't observe this, but they report greater use of remedial strategies we find that their overall attitude and practice of student-centred teaching is much stronger. So I think we're in the realm of education psychology. We're in the realm of remediation, of catch-up strategies, in the realm of formative assessment. We're in the realm of error analysis. Very, very interesting work conducted 30, 40 years ago on error analysis in mathematics. Children make errors in mathematics for a very, very large number of reasons. They may be reading errors, often, and it's often the most common root of an error. A child can't actually read the question that they're being asked to undertake. If they're helped to read the question, they can then do the mathematics. Often, a failure in mathematics is actually not a failure in mathematics, it's a failure in reading. And other types of errors that children make: comprehension errors, transformation errors, process errors, encoding errors. Sometimes children, they can decode everything they've got to do. They select the right cognitive process, the right cognitive operation. They perform that well. They can perform it. They can do it verbally. But then at the end of the day, they don't bring everything back together and they don't encode the information in a way that is presentable back to the examiner in order to achieve a tick. They make mistakes on the way. Now we're into the deep levels of learning. And I'm wondering to what extent the RISE team is proposing to undertake research in this area, given that the starting point of the whole enterprise is learning. I've probably gone over my 15 minutes. I'm sorry.
What I'll ask you to do is to respond to both hands at the end, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll try and be brief. First of all, congratulations on both an exciting paper and to RISE more generally on putting this in the spotlight, equity in the spotlight. I should maybe first say I'm Pauline Rose, Professor of International Education at the University of Cambridge, where I direct the Research for Equitable Access and Learning Centre. We debated heavily the word equity, I can assure you of that. And I'm also the international team lead on RISE Ethiopia, for which Tasu Oldahana is the principal investigator. He will be at the Outfit conference tomorrow, and Kane is also in the team as well. So, and the RISE Ethiopia team is just starting, so some of the sort of issues and discussions we're just starting to get our head around, so this is really helpful as well from that perspective. Now, of course, when you're asked to give comments, you'll give comments, so these are all put in the light of this being really, in my view, sort of both an excellent starting point of thinking about some of these issues and bringing in some new analysis, fresh ways of thinking, and so on. I think a bit like Angela, I don't have quite the same length of experience as Angela, but I think what would be really helpful, I would say also, is to try and situate some of these debates, I think, in relation to this paper, but more generally in RISE, within some of the wider literature and analysis of learning data that has been going on. So the Global Monitoring Report has been doing it. For the Education Commission, we did some analysis for which there's synergies. You've taken some of it forward. You've done different things. So it's not to say that it's all been done by any means, but I just think it helps to situate and probably helps for some of those in the audience and some of us to sort of understand where it is bringing in those new ideas. We're working on a handbook with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, so actually what you've also provided and some of these debates around equity and equality will be very helpful for informing that as well. Secondly, in terms of sort of RISE overall, just picking up on your introduction at the beginning, Claire, on thinking about what this all means in relation to systems research. I'm not sure we really heard that explicitly in the relation to how RISE is understanding systems research. And I'm a bit concerned that that could mean that everybody in the room might have a bit of a different understanding, because that term systems research can mean something very different to different people. So my couple of thoughts were, but I know, Lewis, you've been giving this a lot of thought and you might be able to come back with something far more coherent. But one is around the word coherence that is used a lot in Lant Pritchett's approach to systems research. And is it partly about the starting point being not just about coherence in relation to learning, but coherence in relation to learning at whatever part of the tail we should be focusing on? Or what is it that that this is helping us to understand in terms of systems coherence? One of the issues that Kane and I were having a bit of a debate about, in relation to the paper that Tassa will be presenting tomorrow, was about in relation to a country like Ethiopia, where, you know, every country has it, but from Ethiopia's perspective, where politically it might be quite challenging to target particular populations, it might be quite challenging to target particular regions. So are there implications, and I think there potentially are, of what you're saying in relation to the sort of politics of systems research as well? So I think maybe drawing that out a bit further could be helpful. I then wanted to just actually, building I think a bit on also what Angela was saying about the consequences, pick up on some of the implications of your findings. I noticed neither of you, and maybe this was strategic, mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. Clearly what you're saying does have clear implications for a lot of the discussions that are going on. So for example, in the Global Monitoring Report, a lot of our focus was about trying to look at the extent to which all children were meeting minimum standards, and that is an ongoing debate with the indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals. Is that a right approach, or is it something else that you're suggesting? I would also just say, this is a more specific point, but just to be clear that some of your, if not all of the data, is only focusing on learning of those within schools, which may be, for the purposes of your paper, is perfectly fine, given the types of arguments, but it is important to note that that excludes a lot of children who aren't in school at the time of the learning assessments are taking place. So that is also something we grappled with quite a lot on the Global Monitoring Report. We've worked with the PAL network and others who collect at the household level to enable that access and learning to be looked at simultaneously, and tried to do some work in matching together DHS and other data sets with the learning data sets. But as we know, there are flaws with that. But how can we take that into account? Should we be taking it into account? And that perhaps does relate a bit to the questions about, to what extent are we focusing on trying to raise the minimum standards so everybody reaches a particular level, and therefore we don't necessarily have to target particular groups, or the extent to which we do need to target particular groups. And my sort of reading of what you were saying, and probably my sort of feeling from what I know from the evidence, is that we need to do both. I don't think it's an either or. So at one level, there is the graph that you were showing, Louise, of the 75th to the 25th percentile was showing, that's where you see the majority of the gap. But actually, to address that gap, there are different problems that children with disabilities will face, that will be faced by the poorest who aren't learning, either because they're not in school or because of their opportunities, given the types of schools that they're in, etc. Some of the points that you were both raising. So that was sort of one question I guess I had, and that relates a bit to some of the work I can see Ben Olcott sitting at the back there that we did on a paper with for DFID, that was did a bit of analysis of some of the learning data, but also tried to identify from reviewing the literature, including looking at the systematic reviews, etc., trying to sort of consolidate what we saw as some of the key policy areas, and we narrowed it down to 5 areas. Which were all focused really on the school. So what can we do, given that we have more control perhaps over school reform, not to say that there aren't things outside of schools. And I think this also links quite closely with what you're saying, but maybe be helpful to link up with, see if it is saying the same and perhaps be a bit more consistent then, because I think you threw out some ideas, but the paper perhaps tails off a bit when you get to that. So the 5 areas that we had were needing to start early, with early childhood, before children even start school, teaching at the right pace, which is, as you mentioned, the allocation of the best teachers to where they are needed the most, not an easy thing to do. Not many countries have done it successfully. Again, Vietnam is one of the countries that gets mentioned when that does get mentioned, so what is it about Vietnam that allows that to happen? Making sure that the learning resources are also at the right pace, whether that's the use of technology, whether it's textbooks and so on, are in the right language, are in the classroom, not in the cupboards, and that teachers know how to use them. So that was the 4th one. And then the 5th one was more about, which is perhaps a sort of RISE issue, even more so in relation to working with communities and parents to make sure that they are informed, that they know about the quality of education that their children are getting, and that feeds back into the whole process of learning, that they have a way to identify what it is that's happening within the schools, and there are processes for them to support. And again, that comes from some experience from the PAL network. As I said, those are more school-related reforms. It's not to say that other things like conditional cash transfers, addressing discrimination, gender-based violence, etc., which happens outside the schools, are also important. So those were the 5 areas that we looked at. The other area, which again, Kane, you mentioned, was about the distribution of funding. And again, I think this is potentially a really core issue for RISE. In relation to where are the resources going, because as we know, that's as much political as it is a technical discussion. So in Ethiopia, over many years, it's been highlighted that higher education is getting the bulk of the funding, and yet we know that is inequitable. So how can we shift that pattern if we believe that we have to, in order to address some of these patterns that you've been showing that I would expect we would see in Ethiopia as well? I'm just sort of, I think, just make one last point on the last graph that you were showing, Lewis, that was figure 1, I think, figure 7, sorry, in the paper, if I'm right, or was it figure 1, sorry. The ones that it's figure 7, which was showing us about where the people are on the at different levels, and the differences between the different groups of countries. And I thought part of a question that arises from that is perhaps one, as much as anything, about the test design itself, as well as what it's telling us. And that goes back to this global discussion about and the point that you were making, Angela, are we testing the right things in the right ways for the right populations? And I think this is important as we're moving into a situation of PISA for development. So we have PISA there. When we do bring in developing countries, what is going to happen when we look at those graphs? Is that the right way to go? What are the other options? And I know that this is something that's going to, you're on a panel on Wednesday morning, I think, where this is going to get discussed far more, but I just thought to put that on the table as well. So thank you again for a really great paper and presentation.
Great. Before, I'm sure there are people in the audience eager to ask questions, but just before we open it up, would you guys like to respond?
Just very quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that one did puzzle me, because after we'd already entitled the paper, but it's not even a paper, as it was a note. It started off as 2 pages, then it became about 10. But it's not an answer to all of these questions. In fact, it raises a lot of questions, which I think is the point, and that's why it's so valuable to discuss it. But many of them are quite thorny issues that we can't expect to resolve there. But when you look at the data for a particular country, usually it's been scaled in such a way that you automatically have a normal distribution. So there's no tail, there's no bulge. So to really get a picture of what countries look like together, you have to have a common scale which is centered in the way that Lewis showed. So I think it's only really those PISA and TIMSS graphs that can really give you an idea of how the distribution in a particular country looks relative to something else. And on reflection, it isn't. I think it is usually a long bulge. I mean, it's like one of those dinosaurs with a very large tail, isn't it? Rather than a small head. You know, it's not the picture of the long tail of. I mean, the long tail of schools might be the way of thinking it, rather than the long tail of pupils. But it does depend how you scale the statistics, what the distribution looks like. Do you have more on that?
I don't know how that phrase got in, but I think it's a... No, maybe, I don't know. It doesn't matter. If it was me, I should be flogged. It's really a fat tail, not a long tail. It's the fact that the left end of the distribution is kind of fat. Yeah. I do have a couple of other comments.
Do you want to?
Yeah, just very quickly. So it's more of a fat tail than a long tail. I already said that. I think I agree basically with all the comments. I think they're spot on, and we'll have to review them. Just quickly, I think, Pauline, if in countries where there's a political economic issue with addressing and helping regions, I think if you cast it in terms of regions, that exacerbates the political economy. If you just cast it in terms of cognitive disadvantage, just these are the kids that need the help most. And so that's why I was saying maybe we should learn not to use proxies like region or income or gender, but actually use measured learning. That might help diffuse some of the politics, perhaps. And then the link to the SDGs, good point. I am writing a working paper under RISE that takes these issues apart a bit more, and we do come into the SDGs quite a bit. And I think the SDGs are actually worded in a precisely helpful way, because it talks not about improving the averages, but it talks about increasing or universalizing the percentage of kids that meet a certain, I assume, basic minimum. So I think the wording in the SDGs is precisely helpful and is consistent with this kind of analysis.
Okay, I will just, taking my RISE hat, just offer two quick requests for Angela. You asked about how we think about the history of education, and in particular what's working in the countries that you listed. We've got Jonathan sat over there representing the Vietnam team. And Vietnam is one of our RISE countries precisely for that reason, to understand what has Vietnam got right. So although it's not the countries you mentioned, I think we'll learn a lot from the Vietnamese CRT. And on the point about feedback and assessment, Barbara Brands is a member of the ALT, and we're working closely with Barbara, and she's providing support to many of our CRTs, so we really hope that will be part of CRT work going forward. And on the system point, Pauline, yeah, we're constantly thinking about it, and I think the fact that these guys have raised that it's mainly the inequality, the interquartile range, and that's probably a systemic cause, I think is what situates this as a big part of systems research. Right, enough from us. The floor is now open. Please put your hand up. We'll take questions in threes, and I'd like you to wait for the mic to be passed to you, and then to introduce yourself. So one question there, one here, and one there.
Hi, Nick Spall from Stellenbosch in South Africa. My comment is to pick up on what Pauline said about access, and it's more for your presentation, Louise. Just that if you're looking at SACMEC and PISA and developing countries, it feels like a very large exclusion to not talk about the kids that aren't eligible for these samples. So if you take SACMEC 3, I mean, Mozambique and Malawi, it's like 50–60% of kids that are eligible. In Vietnam, PISA 2015, only half of the kids were eligible for PISA in the first place. So if we take that into account, all of your statistics about inequality are underestimates of the inequalities and also underestimates of the progress that they make over time. So that move to the cognitive middle class is likely to be much more dramatic than what you're showing, because at the same time that they're moving from the left to the middle, they're also drastically expanding access. So it's just a kind of comment to say, if we're talking about inequality, can we really exclude access in any of these countries? Thanks.
I wanted to comment just actually on, Joan D. Jager from the University of Minnesota. I'm a co-lead on the Vietnam CRT. And I wanted to respond a little bit more to Louise's last point a little bit about maybe we should be measuring just that these are cognitive disadvantages or cognitive inequalities rather than measuring, say, region, because politically that can be very problematic in places like Ethiopia, and it is as well in Vietnam. But I want to suggest that actually also measuring it as just a cognitive inequality also is a proxy for many other things that from a political economy perspective we want to and need to understand. So on the one hand, while I hear that, and I can see that might help us on the one hand mitigate some of the politics, part of what, and I don't know how my colleague Jonathan thinks about this, but part of what we want to try and understand is what's going on in the regions politically that's actually creating these disadvantages. And in some cases in Vietnam, it's patronage issues and very disparate financial support, right? But to understand that, we can't just say, okay, this is just cognitive inequality. So on the one hand, I can appreciate that. On the other hand, I think we have to be careful about creating yet other proxies when we want to understand this from a systems perspective and a political economy perspective. And I wanted to also just echo, kind of relatedly, but the point that Angela made about looking at some of these changes over time, because when I first saw the graphs, Louise, that you were presenting about moving from, low learning to middle to high, I actually was thinking about that in terms of time. How does a country do this over time? And I do think that if we try to understand that more, I think we're going to, and that means in our case looking at it regionally, but it also means looking at other equity issues over time in the case of Vietnam.
Jamil. from PAL Network and ITA Azhar, Pakistan. Absolutely fascinating, and really enjoyed Angela's six C's, as well as cognitive inequality and the way this framework is laid out for us. Coming from one of the PAL network countries, and those of us who are involved in citizen-led assessments for lower primary, which is from the SDG 4.1 point of view, not fashionable at all because it's seen as a tier 3 indicator, I was interested to know, one, whether in fact in that analysis that Louis did, whether in fact, where does the cognitive inequality really begin? Where do you catch it? And because we've been trying to argue that that's where you really catch it, so that those issues of literacy and numeracy, those challenges can be addressed much earlier, but we need to get that attention first. And secondly, going back to Angela's point, on what is the right term? Is it a question just of semantics? Do we mean cognitive inequity, or do we mean cognitive inequality? And I think those need to be teased out early rather than later in this SDG 4 game that we are involved in now. And if it's, we can address that earlier, perhaps we'll come up with from assessments to action that we are really pushing for, so that we're not just doing assessments, but really come on to the action piece early on in this race for addressing issues of cognitive equity or cognitive equality. Thank you very much.
Feel free to any of you to respond. Maybe start with Luis.
Okay, very quickly. I won't respond to the ones that I agree with, because what's the point? And I agree with a lot. I think the point about using the proxies or pure inequality, if you will, crucial distinction is between analysis and management. My policy implication or suggestion is that when you're managing a system and trying to help it improve, then focusing on measured inequality or cognitive poverty, if you will, and targeting based on that might be more helpful because it's less politically fraught. But analytically, we need to understand its determinants. Those are pretty different issues. And I think, we didn't use the citizen-based assessments here because they're not necessarily designed to be equally comparable across countries. But certainly from some of the work that we've been doing at RTI and some of the work in it's clear that this inequality starts in the first few grades. And it's clearly related to what Lamp-Pritchett calls, and many others now are calling, teaching at the wrong level, or what I alluded to here, which is systems that shock the children in grade 1 by expecting a kind of level of performance in grade 1 that's completely unjustified given their social environment, given the fact that kids are introduced to 300 new words in grade 1 when they've never even held a book in their hands. That kind of stuff definitely arises right there in grades 1 and 2, or maybe even the lack of pre-grade 1, yeah.
Just to add to that, one of the problems is that there's such a lack of longitudinal data on the same kids going through school in a range of countries that it's difficult to be very precise about that. But when we look in the Young Lives data, which has got 4 countries in it, you do see that the gaps arise early. As early as you can see that in the data, they are very wide. And if anything, they narrow over time, or at least they become more parallel, the lines between more and less advantaged groups and between countries. So the gap at age, let's say 8, between Vietnam and Ethiopia is wider than it is at age 14. But that partly is related to Nick's point that there's so much selectivity. And that's another issue with the longitudinal data. Even if you have successive rounds of PISA data for a country, it's not the same level of access that in the country at the time. So you can't compare the levels directly. And if you go back to the 1960s, you'd have had actually very high levels of educational attainment in Ghana because so few kids were in school. So it's difficult to compare on a time series like that.
Okay, let's take another round of questions. So one here. Others? Yep. One there. Any more takers? Comments as well are welcome. So 1, 2, and then a third there.
So good morning. My name is Benjamin Piper. I'm with RTI based in Kenya, working with countries in that region on improving some of these inequities and inequalities. And actually the question is about some of the outcomes of that work where you're working with governments and try and improve the quality of early primary education. And actually what we found in some of our initial studies is that the size of the poverty effect, so that the gap between the rich and the poor, when you do these sort of interventions focused on the poor, that gap disappears, so that the poor kids have been able to cover that significant difference between the poor and the rich. However, there's an interaction between the intervention and wealth, so that those who are rich gain even more. So you're doing an intervention to catch the poor up to the rich, but because those rich, in quotes, are also benefiting from the intervention, the gap is exacerbated. So imagine the pain when you run that data. You've caught those kids up, and then you've made the problem worse. So from an equity and an inequality perspective, what are the sort of approaches we're learning about how not only to identify those gaps, design interventions to affect them, but also not make the problem worse, so to speak? Thank you.
Thanks. Emma Gremley from British Council. Mine's a very brief question. We've heard in the past from RISE about the equal rights, equal rise. Can you explain a bit more about what that actually means, particularly in light of the presentation today?
I think it's a Land. Come on. Lance likes catchy comments, but I'll hand it back to you.
Stuart Cameron from Oxford Policy Management. I just wanted to ask about
I have a really good one.
I mean, the one that I gave before was simply to say, it's an unfair equality if you have a system in which everybody performs badly, because it's unfair in the sense that children deserve better than that.
But a really interesting statistic is from Tim's data. In Morocco, 60% of the schools don't have a single child above the minimum TIMS level. In Tunisia, only 20% of the schools. So Tunisia, in a sense, so Morocco is more equal because all of its schools are really bad, or 60% of its schools don't have a single child that rises above the minimum floor of TIMS floor. In Tunisia, it's only 20. So you could argue Tunisia is a more unequal country, but in a sense, it's fair or it's equitable because they're kind of in a position to bring those schools up. So that might be an example.
Outside.
Just mixing up good and bad with fair and unfair.
No, because you can have, well, I mean, what fair and unfair are quite similar to good and bad. I mean, they're judgments, aren't they? They're value judgments. But, and maybe Ben's example, you said you had a system which had worsened inequality, but it had improved equity. So you did those two things in opposites. And the second state of affairs was preferable, in my view, to the first one, even though it was more unequal. Do you agree? So it had more fair inequality and less unfair equality.
Do you want to respond to the equal rights, equal rise, or more on Ben's point?
Well, I think the catchy title, Equal Rights, Equal Rise, is partly about the right to a kind of minimum level of proficiency. It's you know, when you're trying to discuss rights, it helps develop rights-based arguments when the rights are fairly starkly delineable. So if you think about the first generation of human rights, they were all kind of dichotomous rights. You have the right to vote, you have the right to assemble, you have certain rights that are either there or not. And one way to discuss this, particularly, now, sorry, in education, the access issue is dichotomous. You're either in school or not. But in learning outcomes, it's a fuzzier thing because the learning outcomes can vary along a very wide spread. So what is your right? Well, one could argue that right could be embodied in the SDGs as the right to at least a modicum of cognitive achievement. So you have the right to and that lines up with the argument around cognitive poverty that's made here, as opposed to only arguing or discussing about equality. I don't know if that helps or not, but the working paper that's coming out will address some of these issues, because the working paper that's coming out shows that inequality, as measured by something like a Gini coefficient or the standard deviation, does not vary systematically with the average level of cognitive achievement in countries, but cognitive poverty does. So it's very clear that as countries improve, the level of cognitive poverty declines. But it's not clear that as countries improve, measured inequality in the sense of a standard deviation or a Gini coefficient improves, or it gets better or worse. There's no correlation.
I think Pauline wanted to have a quick response to that.
I just also come in on Ben's point, because I think it's a really important one about looking at both at the levels of learning as well as the gap in learning. And this is one reason why we've been really pushing for the importance of, with the Sustainable Development Goals, tracking progress for the most disadvantaged group to see what's happening with them on their own, but also to see what's happening between the most advantaged and least advantaged, because you might see things going in one direction, but you need to know both, but that both sets of information are important and potentially have different types of policy responses. In the early 1990s in Ethiopia, you would have seen in terms of access that it appeared that the gender parity was narrowing, that there was a narrower gap between girls and boys, but that was as enrolment was declining. So that's just one example. And then as enrolment started increasing, the gender gap started widening, and we potentially see that in relation to learning. Also, a lot of the evidence around private schools that we see often only looks at the gap. It doesn't show us that also the levels of learning are not always necessarily that good. They might be better than public schools, but they're still not that good. So it's important to actually disentangle both in relation to the sorts of arguments that we're having here, I think.
I'd like to come back to Stuart's question about unfair equalities. Some years ago, well, way back in the 1970s actually, Sri Lanka introduced a very controversial system of access to universities, in which if you had had your schooling in a very poor, disadvantaged rural district, you could gain entry to university with a lower score than someone who had been schooled in Colombo, for example. And at the time, I mean, this was a political solution, political reform, in response to a youth insurrection which had been led by rural youth, complaining about lack of access to universities and lack of access to education. And within the ideology and the politics of the time, it was accepted, and actually that proposal, or that policy, is still running 40 years later. I took that example about 15 years ago to a discussion held at the Institute of Education in London. The discussion was being led by Harvey Goldstein and his team, who were pioneering all the work on value-added and value-added measures, and value-added the coefficients of how much a school added to the value of the learning achievement. And I took the Sri Lanka example and I said, do you think perhaps that when in this country students are considered for entry to university, that added to their A-level scores, we should be adding the coefficient for the value added from the school that they have attended, in order to give advantage to those students who are performing very well, but who have attended schools that do not add very much value to their performance? Well, the reaction was, my goodness, no, absolutely not. And I sat there and I thought, well, I'm sorry, but maybe, I mean, here we are sitting in Oxford, in the middle of Oxford. If we think about the backgrounds and the school backgrounds and the home backgrounds of the majority of students who make it to Oxford, should we be looking at the entrance procedure? Should we be compensating A-level marks with the value-added scores from the school history? I just throw it out for your attention. Would that be an unfair equality? Or would it be a fair inequality? Think about it.
Before I get into trouble for commenting as a former PP admissions tutor on what exactly happens, I will call it to a close. I'll tell you over lunch. I want to thank our panellists, and I just want to offer my reflections on the sort of takeaway points from this. I think introducing the distinction between inequity and inequality, I think most of us here have found really helpful, and that will be great going forwards. The former being a philosophical point, the latter being one of empirical investigation, pointing out that pure inequality as measured by the difference between the 75th and the 25th percentile is huge relative to things we might previously have thought, such as gender differences, and that there may be some route up through the middle, whether we call this a fat tail and trying to get the fat tail up or a long tail, to be continued. Okay. So I think also thank our respondents, Angela and Pauline, for some really, really useful insights, which will inform the work that's going on within RISE on this issue going forward. So thank you to all four of them. I believe we have sandwiches outside. Feel free to